Hello, my friends, and welcome to Momentum Boost. I'm your host, Adrienne Gold Davis, and I'm so excited you're joining us today. So, if you're new here, just feel free to explore the layout. If you want to ask our guest a question, you just click that question mark in the lower left-hand side of the chat box. And know that the questions are visible to everyone here. So, if you'd like to ask a question anonymously, just make sure that you click the hand icon. So, in this episode, we're going to explore the secrets of navigating life's tribulations with grace, with meaning, and with the comfort that we are not alone. We are so thrilled to have Bruce Feiler here with us today. Bruce is the author of 6 New York Times bestsellers. He's the presenter of 2 primetime series on PBS, and he's the inspiration for the NBC drama series, Council of Dads. He's been lauded for his first-hand approach to storytelling. Bruce is known for living the experiences that he has put down on paper. I am so delighted to welcome you. Welcome, Bruce.
Thank you so much, Adrienne, and to Judy and the entire community at Momentum. I have so many personal connections to this wonderful group, and our kind of missions and what we want out of life are so aligned. I'm delighted to be here and looking forward to today's conversation.
Well, I have to say that reading your book and looking at your messages and many of the things you've done over the years has been a revelation. You have a very unique and I think very wise and spiritual approach to reality, which I think is useful and helpful for all of us. So if I may, I'd like to begin with my first question for you, okay? So the title of your new book, Life is in the Transitions. It's a kind of a paradigm shift for most people who assume that life is this linear, direct thing, that they have absolute knowledge of what's going to be and that they're going to navigate in that way. But I need you to expand on the ideas that you've put in your book that turn that notion on its head.
So I appreciate that. And it was a paradigm shift for me too, which in some ways explains kind of why I went on this journey for the last 5 years. To sort of set the stage here, I actually had, Adrienne, what I now think of as a linear life. I grew up in Georgia, 5 generations of Jews in the South. I went to college. I then found early in my life what I wanted to do by being a writer. I sold my first book 31 years ago next month. I traveled around the world in my 20s. Then in my 30s, I started walking the Bible and the kind of religious journeys back and forth to the Middle East. I got married and I had children. And this, I now think of it as something of a linear life. But then in my 40s, I just got walloped by life, a back to back to back set of highly disruptive experiences. First, I got cancer, as you know, and you mentioned, I was a new dad at the time, and I asked a group of men to form a council of dads. Then I almost went bankrupt in the recession. And then my dad in Georgia, who has Parkinson's, tried to take his own life. Actually, 6 times in 12 weeks, this happened. And we were struggling in the way one does in this moment, but I'm the story guy and I'm the meaning guy, as you said. Right. And so one Monday morning, I sent my dad a question, which was, tell me about the toys you played with as a kid. And he thought about it and he couldn't move his fingers, but he dictated the answer to Siri. And it was the first thing in such a long time that gave him life. So I sent another one. Tell me about the house you grew up in. And this went on for years until this man who had never written anything longer than a memo backed into writing an autobiography. And it was such a powerful change. I'm sorry. Yeah, you were.
No, don't, please. I'm sorry. I'm excited about what you're saying. What made you think to send a question? What is it about these questions that opened up something for him in your heart?
Well, I think that the answer to that question, Adrienne, is a couple of things. And what had happened actually is I had just written a book called Secrets of Happy Families right before. And the most interesting idea that emerged from that came from a man named Marshall Duke at Emory and his colleague Robin Fivish, and they found that the children who know more about their family history are better able to navigate the world around them. Sort of knowing your past and being able to tell your story was the what predictor of a child's emotional well-being. So I had been writing a lot, wrote about this in the New York Times, and I went crazy viral. And of course, this, what relates more to Judaism or to religious identity, the idea of an oscillating narrative. Nothing is more oscillating as a narrative than the biblical story, which has periods of stability and instability. So I was interested in storytelling as an idea, but what I didn't realize is that there is all of this work now in a field called narrative gerontology about helping older people to tell their story, narrative adolescence, narrative medicine. And kind of what I realized when I started talking about this is that everybody's story was interrupted in this way.
Right.
And so everyone was saying, like, kind of the heart of your question, like, the life I'm living is not the life I expected. Like, I'm living life out of order because we all expected this linear life that we had been told. And so
why did we expect that, Bruce? Why did we?
Yeah, well, I think that's exactly right. So I think that the answer to that is a historical aberration, actually. So in the ancient world, there was no linear time. So they thought life was a cycle to every season, turn, turn, turn. In the Middle Ages, they think life is a staircase up to middle age. You peak in middle age. So different from how we were all raised. And then it's downhill. So think about that. That's no new love at 40. That's no new job at 50. That's no retiring and moving someplace else and, opening a B&B or a bookstore. None of that. So, but what happens is with the birth of science 150 years ago, everything becomes linear. Okay. So you think about Piaget with childhood development.
Right.
And Freud has various stages of development. Erickson with the 8 stages of moral development. The 5 stages of grief, the hero's journey, these are all linear narratives. And this reaches its peak with Gail Sheehy in the 70s, who writes this book that all of our mothers read that says, life is predictable. Everyone does the same thing in their 20s, the same thing in their 30s, and everyone has a midlife crisis at 39 and a half. I should say that Gail Sheehy died yesterday, and this was a pioneering book. And it helped a lot of women in particular, actually, this was the peak of divorce. This is when women were entering the workplace. But it really is a misleading idea. And we look at the world differently now. We have, chaos theory. We have the internet. We have complexity. But we haven't changed how we look at our lives. And so what happened was when I went out gathering hundreds of life stories of Americans of all ages, all walks of life, hundreds of them, all 50 states, as you know, and I did people who lost limbs, lost homes, changed careers, changed religions, got out of bad marriages, got sober. I then spent a year with 12 people kind of coding these stories. And the big idea that emerged is that this idea of a linear life, one job, one home, one relationship, one sexuality, one source of happiness, that's how we were all raised. That's dead. It's been replaced by what I call a non-linear life that has many twists and turns and transitions. And then, as you said, it turned out that the big idea that emerged is that we're going through more transitions. We need the tools to do it. And my book introduces the first new idea about how to navigate life transitions in 40 years, because exactly what you said, this is a throwback idea that we haven't been talking about.
I also think it was an idea that had its time, but wasn't necessarily accurate, as you were saying. So how do we disabuse ourselves, we who read that book and are constantly disappointed when things aren't linear like we planned? My children who are millennials understand that. They know they'll have a million jobs. They expect upheaval, but we're indoctrinated to that linear thing. And so when everything falls apart, like it has over the last few months, we're left kind of shaking our heads. What do you suggest as a way of moving away from that delusion?
So I think there's a lot in that question. I think that it's very perceptive. And so let me just say a couple things in rapid fire. Rapid fire number one, I've been working on this book for half a decade. I've been walking around. I'm in my home here in Brooklyn Heights. That's a painting from my mom, by the way, over this shoulder, and a painting I gave to my wife from Kenya over that shoulder. And I've been muttering to myself, like, we've got to get over the linear life. Like, we have to know life is nonlinear. We have to master life transitions. And then lo and behold, my book, and people need to think about this. And then lo and behold, my book arrives at this moment when the entire planet is going through a life transition, and everybody recognizes. I think that's one of the reasons that this book, is people turn out to have a visceral need for it. It's an instant bestseller. It's on every list. I've been on every TV show imaginable from this chair in the last few weeks. But I think that the reason it's viscerally interesting is exactly what you said, which is that people feel relieved. Like, I'm not the only one that feels this way. It turns out lots of people. So people feel they're given permission to move beyond this linear construct. The way I like to think of it is that millennials in particular, boomers in particular, I was born in 64, so nominally that's the last year of the baby boom. We're still haunted by the ghost of linearity.
We are. We are.
And that's what I think of it as. But as you said, our children, my children are Gen Z because they're teenagers still. But one of the interesting things that I kind of happened upon is that Xers get this nonlinearity intuitively more than boomers, and millennials more than Xers. So, and then that creates a kind of what I think of as a kind of a transition gap between boomers and their millennial children, because the boomers are thinking, wait, you're getting married before, wait, you're having a baby before you're married, or like you're leaving one job before you have another job, or like you're moving to a new town and you don't even know what you're going to do when you get there.
Right.
Like that is so alien to the boomers who were, as you said, indoctrinated, brainwashed almost with this idea of linearity. But if you think of your life, and I'm talking now to the boomers, if you think of, by the way, there's some street noise out there in my neighborhood in Brooklyn, with apologies, but we're all used to that by now. Some people are born into a life transition if their parents, if there's a sobriety problem or parents get divorced. Some people lose a child as a teenager.
Wait. Expand on that a minute. What does it mean to be born into a transition? Flesh that out a little bit for me.
So I took the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of disruptions that we have in our lives, and I coded them, okay? And so here's what I found before I answer your question. I found that we all face a life disruptor, as I call it, 36 times in our lives. That's one every 12 to 18 months. That's more often than many of us see a dentist. So a disruptor could be something big, like getting married or losing a loved one. It could be something small, like an accident that you have to be on crutches for 6 weeks, right? Or a knee operation, or having new responsibilities at work, or becoming an empty nester. By the way, I use the word disruptor on purpose. It's because in most of the literature on this, they're called stressors or crises. But some of them are not crises. I mean, having a child, I'm a parent of identical twins. Having identical twins was a huge disruptor, but it was joyful, but it was still, traumatic in its own way because everything had to be reimagined. So we go through one disruptor every 12 to 18 months, and most of them we get through. We're actually pretty good. Let's pat ourselves on the back. We can handle transitions and disruptions pretty well. But 1 in 10 becomes a massive change. And I call those life quakes, as you know, because they're kind of higher on the Richter scale of consequences, and they have aftershocks that last for years.
And we're in the middle of now, collectively.
And we're in the middle. So we are in the middle. And by the way, and then these are some of them are about half of them are voluntary, right? You choose to move, you choose to retire, you choose to get sober after a period of 1 in 4 of my stories involves alcoholism or addiction in some way. And half are involuntary. You get a diagnosis, you get laid off, your spouse cheats on you. And then I did personal or collective. So the smallest category was collective involuntary. Right. So a collective involuntary life quake would be the hurricane that's about to hit the Gulf Coast, or it would be at 9/11, or it would be a war. And we are in the first collective involuntary life quake that the entire planet is going through in a century. But what I want to say to people listening here is that that's deceptive, because on one level, we're going through this together. But kind of one of the central findings of this book, as you know, is that the life quake can be voluntary or involuntary, but the life transition that comes out of it must be voluntary. You have to choose to lean in and go through the steps. So the transition that you might need, Adrienne, is different than the one that I need might be someone listening to us or someone watching us later. So everybody is we're going through this together, but the way it's going to impact each of our lives is going to be different. And then just to quickly answer your question, these happen across the lifespan. Right. So we're all going through this now. So imagine. So if you're 39 and a half, which was the original midlife crisis idea, you're having a midlife crisis. But if you're 15, like my teenagers, you're also having a life crisis. And if you're 67, you're also having a life crisis. This alone is an indication they happen across our lives. You may lose a parent at 50, which is when it's predictable and when you are supposed to, or you may lose a parent at 3, as my children almost did, or a teenager. So that's what I mean by these happen all across our lives at an unpredictable pattern. They have nothing to do with birthdays that end in 0. They happen when they happen often when you least expect them to happen.
Oh, Bruce. So, as you talk about reframing in our minds this paradigm of transition versus linear and being able to cope with it, you mentioned that there are some steps. What would you say is the first step?
So the first step, kind of the threshold step, is to choose to go through the transition. But so let's just call that the threshold step. So the first step, to answer your question, is to recognize that there is a process here. Okay, so what happens is you go into a transition, people tend to react, broadly speaking, one of two ways. There's the 217 item to-do list person, like, I'm going to nail it. This is what I'm going to do. I'm going to get through all this by this weekend because I'm a superhero. Then there's the I'm stuck, I'm alone, I'm in a fetal position on my bed kind of person.
Right.
And that's because when you get hit by a life quake, you feel all alone. I remember when I got cancer, I would look out the window and I'm thinking, like, I'm on crutches for 2 years, right? I wrote a book called Walking the Bible, and I hosted a TV. Like, I'm known as the walking guy. I couldn't walk for 3 years, right? And I thought, and I would look out the window and I'd say, well, you can walk. You're not on crutches. Like, you don't know what this is like. You feel isolated and disconnected and all alone. But look at enough of them, as I have done in certain patterns, become clear. And so here's something I can say is to understand life transitions have 3 phases. Okay, there's what I call the long goodbye, where you have to sort of mourn and say goodbye to the old you that's not coming back. There's the messy middle, where you have to shed certain habits and create new ones. And there is the new beginning, where you unveil your new self. And it turns out that each of us is good at one of these phases. I call it your transition superpower. And one of them we're bad at. So let me just ask you. So which one of these 3 phases are you good at? Are you good at saying goodbye? Are you good at the middle? Or are you good at the trying something new?
I'm good at saying goodbye.
You're good at saying goodbye. So this is what's interesting. So a lot of people, 39% in my study, are bad at saying goodbye. Maybe they're people pleasers. Maybe they stay around. Maybe they're conflict averse. Maybe they don't want to say goodbye. Maybe they just like the old life. Like, I like that job, or I like that marriage, or I like being able to, celebrate life, milestone occasions with my mom, who now has Alzheimer's, say. So, but some people are good. I talked to a woman, Nina Collins, who lost her mom. She was biracial. She lost her mom at 19. She's gone on to have 3 marriages and twice as many jobs. And she said, I underattach to things. I'm good at saying goodbye. But you may be bad at the middle, where you get stuck. And I call it the messy middle because it is hard. Half the people say this is their worst phase. But then I talked to a woman who had 3 marriages, actually, and then she loved the messy middle. After her 3rd husband left her, she was like, she went and experimented with herself, discovered herself sexually, and came into herself. I talked to a guy who took over the Simon Pierce Glass Company in Vermont, and he was a consultant. He moved his family from the Midwest to New England. He starts a month after the Great Recession. Sales dropped by 1/3 in the first quarter. It took him a year to realize it was not going to work. It was a family-run business. And he said, I was bad at goodbye. Like, I loved being a mentor. I loved my colleagues. I loved being a leader. But he said, once I got to the middle, like, I made a list. I called 40 people. And then within months, he moved his family to Africa to run a nonprofit. So people are good at these different phases. So my advice, that's what you wanted, was one of the things I try to do in the book is figure out which phase you're best at, start there, and then work to the one you're going to be less good at.
Okay, so that was what I was about to ask you. Of course, if I'd waited a little longer, you see, I'm good at goodbyes. If I'd waited a little longer, I would have.
I want to ask the next question.
Get to the point. But no, seriously, the truth is that there's no linear path with those steps either. In other words, not only is there no linear path, it doesn't even have to have an order. You're saying enter where you're strong. And it doesn't matter which order you do these things in. So how can it be the middle? Yeah,
that's a great question. So the first century, the people talked about life transitions. Let me geek out on the science for 30 seconds. Life transitions was invented by a guy named Arnold van Gennep in Germany 100 years ago. He invented the phrase rites of passage, which never occurred to me was a phrase someone had to invent. And he likened transitions to leaving one room, going down the hallway, and entering a new room. He said, you must do them in order. I'm here to tell you that you must not. Like, that is one of the clearest findings of my study, because think, like, sometimes you leave a room, you go in the hallway, and then, oh, you left something in the old room. Then maybe you want to go peek in the new room to make sure it's going to be nice over there. Imagine I'm sure some people listening to us either have had divorce in their family or know people who've gotten divorced.
Sure.
So if you're divorced and you have children with your prior spouse, you're never fully saying goodbye because you're always being forced to go back in and co-parent with your original spouse. So life transitions, life is nonlinear, and the transitions themselves are nonlinear. You can do them, it's like a fingerprint. Everybody does these phases and these stages in a different order. And then, as you know, I go on to have in my book 7 tools to help you navigate them. People do the tools in a different order. I found that everybody does some naturally. No one does all of them. Everybody wants to get better. But here's the thing, Adrian, like we know, think about what we have learned in the last, generation. Happiness, habits. We know you have to work on them, right? We know your tennis game isn't going to get better and your souffle isn't going to get souffle unless you work on them. We know we have to work on our relationships and we have to work on our bodies. And what I'm finding is that these transitions, let's remember what I found, we go through 3 to 5 in a lifetime. The average length is 4 or 5 years. That means 25 years. That means half of our life we're spending in transitions, and no one is teaching us how to do them better. It's like a lifelong sport that we're never learning how to play. That's why this book is called Life is in the Transitions, because if you just try to grit and grind and suffer your way through them, you're grit and grinding and suffering your way through half of your life. And you're not turning them into the periods of growth and renewal that they have the opportunity to be.
Okay, Bruce, a few of the tools, please.
So let's just start with a simple one, because I actually think that none of us is good at saying goodbye in the pandemic. Because at the beginning we were told, lockdown, we'll get through it, we're going to go back. Well, we're 6 months in, we now know we're not going back. So here's a simple one. Ask yourself this question. What is the biggest emotion you're struggling with right now? When you go through a life transition, so I'll just ask you, I keep guinea pigging you, but let's do it here because you're being revealing. Think of a big life transition you went through. What was the biggest emotion you struggled with?
The potential for becoming obsolete. So I guess ego fear.
Fear. Interesting. Ego fear. Right. By the way, this began with my dad trying to take his own life. That was his big fear. He was always a civic activist, would go to parties and be on boards. And when he had Parkinson's, he didn't want to tell anybody because he thought no one would invite him. It's literally that same sense of kind of generational, by the way, that's a linear model that when our washing machines break down, we throw them away because it's all an industrial model. You don't have that opportunity with a farm. You got to find a way to renew it, right? Number one answer, what people are afraid of, fear. Fear of being obsolete, fear of not having money, fear of being alone, fear of not succeeding. Number 2 answer, sadness. I liked that old life. I missed that person. I liked having money. I liked the status. Sadness. I like the old life, and the old life ain't coming back. The third was especially interesting to me, shame. I'm ashamed I lost my job. I'm ashamed I need help. I'm ashamed of what I did when I had an addiction. I'm ashamed that I have a child with an addiction, I'm ashamed that I have a special needs child. So the first tool, identify and accept the emotions. And the second is so relevant to the community we're in now.
Right.
I ask people how they got through, how they moved beyond this emotion. Some people write their feelings down. I talked to a woman who left a corporate job for a lifestyle job of helping people with second homes in Maine. She literally wrote down her feelings, her fears, and her goals, so she would see them every morning by her bed. Some people do what I do, which is buckle down, like stop whining and go to work, like plow your way through it. But 80% of the people that I talk to used rituals of some kind. They held, memorial services. They buried something in the backyard. They got a tattoo. I talked to a woman in Los Angeles, Lisa Ray Rosenberg. She had an awful year. She was a bone marrow donor to her brother. She had a big falling out with her mother. They became estranged. She went on 52 first dates. She actually made a spreadsheet of everything she wore on the first dates because she only went on 7 second dates, and she didn't want to wear the same clothes on the second date. She didn't wear on the first date. Anyway, she said her biggest fear was heights. She said, this isn't working. She jumped out of an airplane. And what these rituals are is they're ways of saying to ourselves and to the loved ones around us, I'm going through a difficult time. I'm having a transition. but I'm going to use these rituals to say I acknowledge it. It's why religion still has life cycle events as a way of marking time and taking something that seems, ongoing and structureless and give it some structure.
What you're saying that is surprising and actually refreshing is that you're saying we're not just celebrating the good stuff. We are actually naming, ritualizing, and acknowledging the uncomfortable, which I think takes some of the sting away, takes it out of the, oh, I have a question here for you. Can I ask you? This is from Gary. The loss of my 92-year-old mother in May from COVID-19. I'm sad that she passed alone in a New York hospital, alone because family wasn't allowed to be with her. What would you recommend to help me and the family find meaning in this loss? Wow.
First of all, I'm sorry for your loss, and thank you for sharing. And this is a kind of a visceral reminder that we are in this structural kind of new time. I mean, and that's kind of one of the things that I just want to pause to acknowledge is that this is one illustration of what each of us is feeling in some larger way, which is that this is non-normal. Okay, we've taken the normal and we've entered a period of non-normal, and exactly what you're feeling is kind of what I heard in a lot of these conversations is you're in a period that is structureless. One of the things that is in actually life is the transitions is I ask people how they navigated these times. And so what I would begin with is I'll try a simple thing and then I'll give you a complex thing. The simple thing is say out loud, as you've just done in a public forum, that you're sad and confused and bewildered and maybe a little angry and frustrated. And so a problem shared is a problem halved. And so right there, when people go to group therapy, it turns out the more they talk in the group therapy, the happier they are. So they don't even need to listen to other people. It's the sense of sharing. So I would say, identify these emotions. I would say, share them with somebody else. I think I heard you use the word we there, which suggests to me that you are sharing it with loved ones. That can be a very powerful feeling to feel like you have a team, that you're not alone, which is so desperately difficult. Any kind of ritual now, I think, would be helpful, even if it's just taking a memento. Mementos was a big theme. People use mementos to mark life transitions. So even if you can't get to your mother's house because you can't come to New York and leave wherever you are, I'm guessing you have in your own home some memento that will remind you of your mother. Maybe put that in a prominent place so that you can, the social scientists call it snack on it. So if you have something, I'm looking over on my bookshelves over here that you can't see, and there's a picture of me and my family. Is there something that is a place to do something with your feelings? You can create like a little shrine, shall we say? That's what a lot of Eastern religion people do. But something so that when you're feeling lonely, you can connect, okay? But then I want to give you I told you I was going to give you a harder one to work on. I asked a lot of people how they structured their time in a life transition, especially now where time seems structureless. And there were different styles. It turns out that this has to do with how they design games. Some people like what's called a sandbox, where you put borders around yourself and then you experiment within. So these are people who like to, say, experiment sexually or try drugs or do something to give yourself boundaries where you can experiment with new things. Some people like linear structure of time. Like maybe you're the person who wants to take a course, right? Or go through, say, a mourning process. Think of the Jewish mourning process of 30 days, right? Or maybe your mother used to read to you and you want to say, you know what? I'm going to go back and I'm going to reread Dostoevsky or Jane Austen or, I don't know, Updike or someone like that. That's a linear thing that will get you through time to mark this period. And other people like cycles. So maybe these are people who like to exercise, right? Or maybe there's something, a walk. Maybe you say, you know what, every Sunday afternoon, I'm going to take a walk and think about my mom for an hour, and you take a walk, right? Or every Tuesday night, I'm going to journal about my mother. So think about different ways you can have incidents, you can have journeys you can go on, or you can have something cyclical you can do to kind of give yourself a set time every week where you can go into your feelings and spend time with your mom.
You know what, Bruce, thank you. And thank you, Gary, for being vulnerable with us. And I might add to you, Gary, for what it's worth, that from a Jewish perspective, it's a wonderful thing to either learn something deep and meaningful in the merit of her soul, or even actually to take on one of the characteristics you most admire in her and practice them in the merit of her. Bruce, you are, I could talk to you for hours. I'm so grateful. I didn't even get through half of what I wanted to ask you.
I
And
talked
so
too
I
long.
so appreciate your sharing your time and thoughts with us today. Truly, thank you. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for including me, for your empathy and and I'll just close with this thought.
Okay.
Transitions work. 90% of the people I talked to said they got through their difficult times. So whatever you're struggling with, I've been there. Lots of other people, I've met a lot of people, and they gave me not just hope, but actual practical things that I could do. So my goal here is to try to give you things. It's not going to be right for everybody, but you're going to find some ideas to make whatever you're struggling with, whatever you're dealing with, go a little bit better and a lot more effectively. There is wisdom out there. We're going to get through this time together, everybody.
Amen. Amen. Thank you again.